I spent New Year's Eve watching my wife transfer my entire life savings into an account I am not allowed to see. The digital clock on the microwave in our Long Island City apartment ticked toward midnight on December 31st, 2025, while the glow of my laptop screen illuminated the cold, hard truth of my marriage. For most people in New York City, this night was about resolutions and expensive champagne. But for me, it was the final confirmation that I was living with a predator. I sat in the darkness of the kitchen, listening to the muffled sounds of celebrations from the street below, and the rhythmic tapping of my wife's expensive heels in the bedroom. My name is Caleb, and I'm an architect who built structures designed to last centuries. Yet I failed to see that my own home was built on a foundation of professional-grade deception. I am 37 years old and I have been married to a woman named Clara for 7 months. We have been a couple for 3 years in total, but the clarity I achieved tonight makes those 3 years feel like a fever dream I am finally waking up from. The realization did not hit me like a lightning bolt, but rather like the slow, steady calibration of a lens. 3 months ago, I received a diagnosis of ADHD and began a treatment plan that included medication designed to help me focus on the complex blueprints of the skyscrapers I design. What the doctor did not tell me was that the medication would also allow me to hyperfocus on the structural flaws of my personal life. Before the meds, my world was a haze of anxiety and depression, and a constant sense of inadequacy. I believed Clara when she told me that the tension in our home was a result of my disorganized mind and my inability to be a present partner. I accepted the blame for every argument and every cold night of silence. I took the entire weight of the relationship on my shoulders, believing that if I just worked harder and earned more, the woman I loved would finally be satisfied. I was a man wandering through a thick fog, and Clara was the only guide I thought I had. Tonight, the fog vanished completely. I watched the transfer complete. $4,800 from my primary pay account moved into the joint account and then instantly vanished into a secondary savings account held in her name alone. I have no access to this account. I have no password and no legal visibility. Every month for the last year and a half, I have had to ask my own wife for permission to buy lunch or pay for a subway pass. She told me it was for my own good and that my impulsive nature made it impossible for me to manage a budget. She framed her financial control as an act of maternal protection. Standing in the kitchen, I realized I was not a partner, but a high-yield asset that she was liquidating in real time. Clara walked into the kitchen wearing a silk dress that cost more than I was allowed to spend on myself in an entire quarter. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance and told me that she was heading out to a gala in Manhattan. She said I should stay home because the crowds would be too overstimulating for my condition. This was her signature move. She used my medical diagnosis as a cage to keep me isolated. When I asked her about the tax documents for the apartment, she didn't even blink. She told me I was being paranoid and that my medication was making me aggressive. She looked me in the eye and lied with a kind of practiced ease that only comes from years of systemic manipulation. She gaslit me about the very conversation we were having while we were having it. I have attempted to have this conversation 40 times in the last year. I have spreadsheets of the times I asked for transparency and the times I was told I was too mentally unstable to handle the truth. Each time I set a boundary, she moved the goalposts. She had successfully isolated me from my support network, claiming my old friends were toxic influences who didn't understand my neurodivergence. I had sacrificed my oldest friendships to make her feel secure. Now, on the biggest night of the year, in the greatest city on earth, I was completely alone in a $3 million condo that I was paying for but didn't actually own. The lack of intimacy in our home was the most glaring indicator of the fraud. Our marriage has never been consummated. For 7 months, I have slept in the same bed as a woman who treats my touch like a professional inconvenience. She had a list of reasons that changed every week: stress and work and her own health and my supposed instability. I had reached a point where I felt less like a man and more like a ghost inhabiting a space I wasn't allowed to touch. The urge to cheat was not born out of lust, but out of a desperate, primitive need to feel human again. I wanted to be seen by someone who didn't look at me as a source of revenue. I wanted to feel a connection that wasn't transactional. I had even begun to formulate a plan to find that connection just to prove to myself that I was still alive. But as I watched her leave for the party, I felt a shift in my perspective. Cheating would be an emotional reaction, and what I needed now was an institutional response. The clarity from the meds was like a cold scalpel. I went to her private office, a room I was usually forbidden from entering under the guise of her needing a quiet space for her freelance consulting work. I began to look for the physical reality behind the digital lies. I knew that in a city like New York, every dollar leaves a footprint. Clara was arrogant enough to believe I would never look. She thought I was still the broken man who would apologize for breathing too loudly. I found the ledger hidden inside a decorative box on the top shelf. It was not a record of savings, but a record of laundering. She was moving 60% of my salary into an account owned by her mother in New Jersey. She was effectively draining my net worth and building a fortress for herself that I could not touch in a standard divorce. She was planning her exit long before I even realized there was a problem. The financial abuse was not just about control, it was about total asset stripping. I sat on the floor of her office and photographed every page of that ledger. I felt no anger. I felt a profound sense of relief. The guilt I had carried for years was gone. I was not the unstable one. I was the one being hunted. I realized then that a divorce would be too slow and too expensive. In New York, an annulment is difficult but not impossible if the marriage was built on a foundation of fraud and was never consummated. I had the paperwork ready in a digital vault she didn't know existed. I had been preparing for the end while she was preparing for the kill. I spent the next 4 hours mapping out the equity in our apartment. I had used my premarital inheritance for the down payment, and while she had tried to mingle the funds, I had the original wire transfers documented. She thought she was going to walk away with the equity and my future earnings, but she had underestimated the architect. I knew the load-bearing walls of our legal contract, and I knew exactly which one to pull to make the whole structure collapse on her head. I went back to the living room and watched the fireworks over the East River. It was officially 2026. The city was screaming in celebration, but I was sitting in a silence that felt like power. I had not had sex in 18 months, and I had no money in my pocket, but I was the most dangerous man in Clara's life because I was the only one who knew who she really was. I was going to play the role of the dutiful husband for a few more weeks. I would be the shadow she wanted me to be while I secured the testimonies of the people she thought she had turned against me. I was going to reach out to my old network and tell them the truth. I was going to show the world the ledger and the wire transfers. The urge to find a fleeting connection was gone. I didn't need a stranger to make me feel human. I needed to destroy the person who had tried to turn me into a machine. I looked at the photos of the ledger on my phone and felt a cold satisfaction. Every time she had told me I was crazy, and every time she had told me I was forgetting things, she was just trying to cover the sound of the money leaving my account. She was a thief who had used a marriage license as a weapon. I was done being the victim of her narrative. I walked to the window and looked out at the lights of Manhattan. I was 37 years old, and I was starting from zero. But I had my mind back. I had the focus and the evidence and the patience of a man who builds skyscrapers. Clara would come home tonight smelling of expensive gin and smelling of a life she thought she had stolen from me. She would see me sitting in the dark and she would probably make a comment about my depression. I would smile and I would agree with her, and I would go to bed and dream of the day I served her with the papers that would take everything back. This was not a story about a man who wanted to cheat. This was a story about a man who was learning how to win. I began to draft the emails to the forensic accountants I knew through my firm. I needed a professional trail that would stand up in court. I needed to show that the money moved to her mother was a direct violation of our prenuptial agreements regarding marital assets. I was going to use every resource at my disposal. I spent the rest of the night creating a timeline of her gaslighting and matching it against the dates of the bank transfers. The pattern was undeniable. Whenever I got close to the truth, she would stage an emotional crisis or accuse me of a mental breakdown to divert my attention. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, and I was finally reading the manual. As the sun began to rise over the skyline, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. I was no longer afraid of her. I was no longer afraid of my own mind. I was the architect of my own liberation, and the first phase of the demolition was already underway. I would wait for the right moment, and I would strike with the precision of a master builder. The year 2026 was not going to be the year of my collapse. It was going to be the year of her reckoning. I closed my laptop and went to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee with the last of the beans I had bought with the meager allowance she had granted me. It was the last time I would ever feel like a beggar in my own home. The first week of January 2026 in New York was a masterclass in atmospheric pressure as the gray sky sat heavy over the skyscrapers, and I sat in my office at the firm, drafting a blueprint for a building that would never be built. It was a decoy project, a set of files I kept open on my screen whenever Clara checked my remote access logs. But beneath the layers of digital architecture, I was constructing a different kind of structure. I was building a cage for a predator, and I was using her own arrogance as a primary load-bearing wall. The medication for my ADHD had turned my once scattered mind into a high-resolution scanner, and for the first time in 3 years, I was seeing the structural integrity of my life for exactly what it was, which was a hollow shell held together by my own silence. I spent the morning documenting the transfer of $5,000 from my account to hers, which had happened while I was supposedly sleeping after the New Year Eve celebration. I didn't feel the old familiar sting of betrayal. Instead, I felt the cold satisfaction of a surveyor identifying a fatal flaw in a foundation. I had spent the last 3 years in a state of emotional subsidence, taking the strain of every argument and every failure upon myself as if I were the only variable that mattered in the equation of our marriage. I had believed her when she said that my neurodivergence made me an unreliable witness to my own life. I had accepted the diagnosis of the broken partner, while she played the role of the long-suffering saint. But as I watched the cursor blink on my screen, I realized that the saint had been harvesting my bank account like a private orchard. I reached out to Arthur, a man who had been my closest friend and mentor before Clara convinced me that his blunt honesty was a sign of hidden toxicity. Reconnecting with him was the first step in reclaiming the support network she had systematically dismantled. We met in a small basement bar in Brooklyn, where the music was loud enough to mask a conversation, and the shadows were deep enough to hide the fact that I was shaking. Arthur didn't lead with an "I told you so," even though he had every right to. He looked at the screenshots of the bank transfers and the photos of the hidden ledger I had taken, and his face went from concern to a hard professional mask. He was a man who understood the mechanics of power, and he saw immediately what Clara was doing. He explained that by moving the money to her mother in New Jersey, she was trying to create a jurisdictional barrier that would make it harder for a New York court to claw back the assets in a standard divorce. But he also pointed out the flaw in her plan. If I could prove that the marriage was never consummated and that the financial transfers began before the wedding as a condition of her staying in the relationship, I was looking at a case for fraud and an annulment that would bypass the standard division of assets. He told me that I needed to stop acting like a victim and start acting like a witness. I went home that night and performed the most difficult task of my life, which was to sit across from her at the dinner table and listen to her talk about her day as if I didn't know she was stealing the very air I breathed. She was in a good mood because the gala had gone well, and she had secured a new consulting contract that she claimed would finally allow us to save for a house of our own. It was a lie so layered and so complex that I almost admired the craftsmanship of it. She sat there in the light of the expensive pendant lamp I paid for, telling me that once my mental health was more stable, we could finally think about a real future. I realized she was using the promise of a future as a tether to keep me in the present, where she could continue to drain me. I kept my voice steady and my heart rate low, even as she began the familiar routine of questioning my memory of our budget. When I asked her about the missing $5,000, she didn't even hesitate. She told me that I had authorized a transfer 3 weeks ago to cover the end-of-year maintenance fees for the condo, and that my ADHD was clearly causing me to lose track of my commitments again. She did this in the same conversation where she praised me for my focus at work. It was a paradox designed to keep me in a state of constant self-doubt. I had documented over 40 such conversations in the past year, where she would claim I said things I never said, or promised things I never promised. Tonight, I had a voice recorder hidden in my pocket of my blazer. I watched her face as she lied, and I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't fighting for her love anymore. I was gathering the bricks for her prison. The next day, I took a train to New Jersey. I needed to see the house that my sweat and my late nights at the firm were paying for. I found the address in the mother ledger, and when I arrived at the suburban street, I saw a modest colonial that was in the middle of a massive renovation. There was a crew of contractors installing a high-end kitchen, and the materials sitting in the driveway were identical to the ones I had specified for a luxury project 6 months ago. I realized then that Clara wasn't just stealing my money, she was stealing my professional intellectual property to upgrade her mother's estate. I took photos of the permit signs on the lawn, which listed the owner and the contractor. The contractor was a cousin of Clara, a man I had met once at our wedding and never seen again. The circle of the conspiracy was widening, and it included her entire family. I returned to Long Island City and spent the night in the spare room, which I had claimed as my home office. Clara didn't object because she preferred not to be bothered by my supposed sleepwalking and restless legs. I spent the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning building a forensic timeline. I matched every one of my bonus checks to a specific renovation milestone in the New Jersey house. I matched every period of her increased gaslighting to a period of large financial transfers. The pattern was as clear as a skyscraper in a blue sky. When I was most vulnerable, she was most predatory. I realized that my self-value had been at an all-time low, not because of my diagnosis, but because I was being poisoned by a person who needed me to be weak so she could be rich. I realized I was financially trapped in the immediate sense because I had no liquid cash, but I had the equity in the condo. This apartment was the only thing she hadn't been able to fully liquidate yet because it required my signature for any major change. I checked the deed again and verified that the premarital inheritance I had used for the down payment was protected under the terms of our initial agreement, provided I could prove that the subsequent mortgage payments were made entirely from my separate earned income, which she had been laundering. I began the process of quietly listing the property with a broker I trusted, a woman who knew the situation and was willing to keep the listing private until the moment we were ready to close. I wasn't just leaving a marriage, I was liquidating a crime scene. The urge to cheat that had plagued me for weeks had completely evaporated, replaced by a singular focus on institutional retribution. I didn't need the shallow warmth of a stranger when I had the cold fire of a perfectly executed plan. I started reaching out to the support network I had ignored for 3 years. I called my sister and my old colleagues and told them I was going through a difficult time and needed to verify some facts from the past few years. They were surprised to hear from me, but they were also relieved. They told me stories of how Clara had called them to tell them I was having a breakdown or that I needed space to deal with my new medication. She had built a wall of lies around me to keep anyone from seeing the truth of our life. As the wall came down, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. By mid-January, I had the paperwork for the annulment fully prepared. Arthur had found a specialist who dealt specifically with cases of domestic financial fraud and non-consummation. We had enough evidence to prove that the marriage was a sham from the beginning, designed solely to provide Clara with a stable income stream to fund her family lifestyle. But I wasn't ready to serve her yet. I needed one more piece of the puzzle. I needed to know where the rest of the money was going, because the renovations in New Jersey didn't account for everything I had earned. There was a gap of nearly $200,000 that was still missing, and I knew Clara was too smart to just leave it in a standard bank account. I began to watch her more closely at home. I noticed that she had started taking long walks in the evening, and that she always returned with a renewed sense of confidence. I followed her one night, keeping a safe distance as she walked toward the waterfront. She met a man in a black SUV and they spoke for 20 minutes. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw her hand him a small envelope. It wasn't an affair in the traditional sense, it was a handoff. I realized that she was investing in something else, perhaps a business or a property that was even further removed from my reach. I didn't feel the urge to confront her. I just took a photo of the license plate and sent it to Arthur. The realization that my entire life was being used as a bank for a criminal enterprise should have broken me, but instead, it made me feel invincible. I was 37 years old and I had been played for a fool, but the fool was dead and the architect was in charge now. I went back to our apartment and sat on the sofa waiting for her to return. When she walked in, she looked at me with that same condescending pity and asked if I had remembered to take my meds. I looked her in the eye and told her that I had never felt more focused in my entire life. She smiled, thinking she had succeeded in managing her assets, but I was looking at a woman who was standing on a trap door, and I was the only one with the key to the lever. The year was 2026, and the architecture of my revenge was nearly complete. I spent the next several days working with a private investigator Arthur had recommended. We tracked the license plate of the black SUV to a developer who was known for taking under-the-table investments for luxury rentals in Queens. Clara wasn't just saving for her mother. She was building her own real estate portfolio with my salary as the seed money. The $200,000 was her stake in a new development project. She was planning to be a landlord in the same city where she made me ask for money for a sandwich. The irony was a jagged edge that I used to sharpen my resolve. I was no longer just looking at an annulment. I was looking at a total seizure of her illegal investments. I had the paperwork ready to go, and she still had no idea. She thought I was the same broken man who spent his night staring at the ceiling and apologizing for his own existence. She didn't realize that every time she gaslit me about the budget, I was adding another zero to the amount I would be claiming in the settlement. I was not just going to divorce her. I was going to erase the last 3 years of her life and take back every cent she had stolen with interest. My self-worth was no longer at an all-time low. It was rising like a skyscraper in a new development zone. I was ready to put my wants and needs before hers, and I was going to do it with the full weight of the legal system behind me. I decided to set the final trap for late January. I told her that I had received a massive year-end bonus from the firm and that I wanted her to manage it because I didn't trust myself with that much money. I watched her eyes light up with greed, and I saw the predator prepare for one last kill. She told me she was so proud of me and that this money would finally secure our future. She had no idea that the bonus check was a fake, a prop I had created to see exactly where she would try to move it. I gave her the check and watched her log into her hidden accounts on her phone. I had installed a screen recording software on the home network, and for the first time I saw the names and numbers of every account she owned. I had the map to her entire empire, and I was about to set it on fire. The night before I planned to serve her, I sat in the living room and watched the snow fall over Long Island City. It was beautiful and cold and unforgiving. I thought about the man I was 6 months ago, a shadow of a person who wanted to cheat just to feel a spark of humanity. I didn't need that spark anymore. I was the sun and the moon in my own universe, and I was about to bring the light of day to Clara's darkest secrets. I was damn sure to be getting an action plan together, and the final pieces were falling into place with the precision of a clock. I had the accommodation lined up, and the selling of the condo was already in the final stages of a quiet deal. I was moving my equity out of her reach before she even knew the game had changed. I checked the paperwork one last time. The annulment was based on the fact that the marriage was never consummated and was entered into under false pretenses with the intent of financial exploitation. I had the medical records that showed a lack of intimacy, and I had the financial records that showed a pattern of systematic theft. I had the recorded conversations of her gaslighting and the photos of her meeting with the developer. I had a support network that was standing by to testify to her manipulation. I was no longer unreasonable or immoral. I was a man who had been pushed to the edge and had decided to build a bridge back to his own life. Clara came into the room and sat next to me on the sofa. She put her hand on my arm and told me that we were going to have a great year. She said she was so glad I was finally getting my ADHD under control and that she looked forward to us being a real couple. I looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel any fear or any guilt. I just felt a cold professional curiosity. I wondered how she would look when the walls finally came down. I told her I agreed that 2026 was going to be a year we would never forget. She smiled and went to bed thinking she had won. I stayed on the sofa and watched the snow cover the city, waiting for the morning when the architect would finally unveil his masterpiece of retribution. The architecture of a perfect collapse requires a deep understanding of the load-bearing points, and I spent the final weeks of January 2026 identifying exactly where Clara had placed the weight of her deception. On the final Tuesday of the month, the temperature in New York dropped to a level that made the glass of our floor-to-ceiling windows groan under the pressure of the cold. I sat at the kitchen island and watched the morning sun hit the skyline of Manhattan across the river. Clara walked into the room wearing a cashmere robe and a look of practiced concern as she asked if I had remembered to schedule my next psychiatry appointment. She was still using my ADHD diagnosis as a way to maintain the narrative of my instability, but she was unaware that the medication had allowed me to design a blueprint for her complete institutional removal. I handed her a thick manila envelope and told her it was the documentation for the new trust fund I was setting up for our future children. She opened it with the eager greed of a predator, and her face went from a mask of curiosity to a pale shade of gray as she realized she was holding a petition for an annulment based on systemic financial fraud and the non-consummation of the marriage. The next 60 minutes were a masterclass in the failed mechanics of gaslighting. She tried the old routines of telling me I was confused and that I was misinterpreting the bank statements and that my mental health was causing me to hallucinate problems that did not exist. But I did not react with the old anxiety or the desperate need for her approval. I sat in silence and played a recording from my phone of her meeting with a developer in Queens, where she discussed using my bonus money to secure a silent partnership in a new luxury rental building. The sound of her own voice discussing the laundering of my wages into her mother estate in New Jersey was the final nail in the coffin of her narrative. I told her that my legal team had already filed an injunction to freeze the accounts in New Jersey and that the developer had been served with a notice of pending litigation regarding the source of her investment funds. For the first time in 3 years, Clara had no words because the architecture of her lies had no more room for expansion. She tried to scream and she tried to throw a crystal vase I had bought her for our anniversary, but I had already called the building security to witness the serving of the papers. As the security guard stood in the doorway, her rage turned into a desperate plea for a second chance. She claimed she did it for us and that she was only trying to build a safety net because she was afraid of my instability. I looked at her and felt absolutely nothing. The urge to find a human connection with someone else was gone because I had finally found a connection with my own self-worth. I told her she had 2 hours to pack a suitcase and leave before the locks were changed. The condo was already under contract for a private sale, and the equity that she thought she could claim was being held in escrow pending the final ruling on the annulment. By the end of the day, she was gone, and the apartment felt like a cathedral of silence. I reached out to my sister and my old colleagues, and for the first time in years, I poured out the raw emotions of what I had been through. I was heard, and I was respected, and I was finally free from the shadow of the woman who had tried to erase me. I spent the next several months working with the forensic accountants to track down every cent that had been moved out of my accounts. We recovered over 80% of the stolen funds from her mother estate after the court ruled that the transfers were a direct result of financial abuse. The annulment was granted in record time because the evidence of non-consummation and the documented history of her gaslighting made the marriage a legal nullity from the start. Clara tried to fight back in the beginning, but her reputation in the Manhattan consulting world was destroyed as the details of the fraud became public knowledge in professional circles. She moved back to New Jersey to live in the half-finished house she had tried to build with my money, but the bank eventually foreclosed on the property because the funds to finish it had been frozen and returned to me. She was a woman who lived by the lie, and she was eventually buried by the truth. I stayed in New York and continued to build skyscrapers, but I never again ignored the structural integrity of my own life. I learned that my ADHD was not a weakness to be managed by a predator, but a unique perspective that allowed me to see the world in high definition. The feeling of wanting to cheat because I wanted to feel human was a symptom of a much deeper infection, and once the source of that infection was removed, I felt more alive than I ever had. I began to rebuild my social network, and I found that the people who truly cared about me had been waiting for me to wake up all along. I am now 38 years old, and the year 2026 is the year I finally claimed as my own. I sit in my new office overlooking the city, and I realize that the most beautiful structure I have ever designed is the one that allows me to stand on my own 2 feet without the weight of someone else's deception holding me down. I am no longer a shadow, and I am no longer a victim. I am the architect of my own destiny, and the foundation is finally solid.